So to get today's event underway, it's my great privilege to introduce our first distinguished speaker, Phelim O'Neill. Phelim, I'm sure, as they say, needs no introduction, but he's the Global Market Intelligence Specialist for the Irish Farmers Journal, and he specialises in the red meat sector and international agricultural trade. A native of County Tyrone, with a background in farming, he brings extensive industry experience to his analysis of Irish and global agriculture. Before joining the journal, Phelim served as the Chief Executive of the Northern Ireland Meat Traders and Exporters Association and held a leadership role at the Livestock and Meat Commission. So it's over to you, Phelim.
Thanks very much for those kind remarks, Jerry. If I was introducing myself, I would be describing myself as the person in the room with a little knowledge. And as we all know, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Anyway, I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so on just to kind of picking up on the points that was made there in the opening remarks. So much of what the profitability and driving profitability at farm level in beef is how you manage that business. And what I'm talking about here for the next 20 minutes or so, while it's good to know and it's interesting to know, etc., at the end of the day, there's not much that I can do or any of us can do on a Northern Irish farm about the numbers of cattle or the price of beef in Brazil or what the demand or the trade's like in China. It doesn't matter that it's going up or it's going down. The reality is we're not going to be interfacing ourselves there on that directly, though of course our processors may be dealing with it either directly or indeed indirectly. So over the next 20 minutes or so, and I know, Chairman, you handed the baton over to me precisely on time, so I'm going to try and do the same to bring myself to a stick within the 20 minutes that I have. So the global beef trade, it's very much, and I just use this here as a random slide, it is very much intercontinental, inter-country, it's all over the place, essentially. We're not that actively involved in most of it, but at the same time, what happens elsewhere in the world can and does have an indirect effect on all of us. And I suppose to start off with just a very, very brief overview, and thanks to USDA, and they use carcass weight equivalent here in terms of their beef numbers. But their estimate for 2026 is that there'll be about 61 million tonnes or thereabouts of beef produced this year around the world. And that's down a little bit from last year. It was 61, almost 62 million tonnes then. So there's immediately the suggestion is that there's going to be less beef in circulation globally in 2026 than there was in 2025. And of course, we would be all very well aware at farm gate level, the price would have increased significantly in 2025, very much driven by scarcity of supply in our main markets. So at a global level, it's going to be suggested to be even less next year. Global cattle population, again, it seems to be on a downward trend. It's now just over 900 million head, and just back in 2023, which isn't that long ago, just over 2 years ago, it was at 944 million. Now again, number of head of cattle on a global basis, not all animals are as productive as they are, certainly in this part of the world, or indeed in North America, or the other major beef producing regions even. So coming back then to what's traded out of that or what's exported, and again USDA are estimating that there'll be about 13.5 million tonnes or thereabouts of beef traded this year, very much between 4 major players in the world marketplace, Brazil, Australia, USA. USDA, they include India and the buffalo there. I tend not to focus so much on them because what's exported of it is very much circulated within other neighbouring Asian markets to them. It doesn't go really beyond that. So those are the big numbers. You can see 3/4 of the beef that's traded internationally is essentially between these countries. And just looking at individual numbers, and I'll zone in on some of the bigger players in a moment or two here, but just to look at the big picture for a start in terms of where it is, you can see China jumps out at you there straight away, that it is the biggest importer in the world by a considerable distance. Down at the very bottom then you can also see United States is a major player. They're unique in that they're both a major importer and a major exporter. The level of their imports has been growing over the last couple of years, particularly because their cattle population, their cattle herds at its lowest point in 75 years. And if you look at North American, and particularly United States industry, has been really struggling for numbers. And Tyson Foods, would be one of the world's biggest advanced meat processing factories. They would have shut it down in Nebraska there just a couple of weeks ago. So there is a period of adjustment going on there, but they're still a major importer. And the one I've highlighted here, I think, and this is the one that's particularly relevant to us in this room, is that the United Kingdom is actually the world's 5th largest beef importing country in the world. It comes behind, obviously, China, United States, and then the other big Asian markets of Japan, South Korea. So that is the market that essentially, that as Northern Ireland being part of the UK, that we're essentially domestic suppliers to. So we'll come into it in more detail in a moment. Then in terms of the exporting countries, well, if China stands out as the world's biggest importer of beef, Brazil stands out as the world's biggest exporter of beef. And they're followed by Australia, who have just announced record export figures for 2025. Their exports and their production system is very much dictated by weather. They would have had a long period of drought up sort of in the later years of the last decade, and they would have spent the first years of this decade recovering from that and herd rebuilding, and now they're back to probably their full potential or close to their full potential in terms of production. So you can see there that they would be the second player there. And the United States, despite the fact that they are going through a particularly low period of cattle numbers, they will still have exported over 1 million tonnes of beef in 2025. And again, that's it's about carcass balance. I'll come back to that in some more detail in a minute. So I'm just going to start with Australia and putting some numbers on it. They exported 1.5 million tonnes or thereabouts in 2025 to 83 different countries around the world. Their main export market is the United States. Again, opportunities created by scarcity of their supplier. The volume increased there by 13% last year, and 453,000 tonnes, a hell of a lot of beef that went from Australia to the US. They had favourable tariff up until what President Trump referred to as the Liberation Day tariffs in April of last year. They would have had almost tariff-free access to the United States with the trade deal that they had. They now carry, I think it's a 10% tariff on top of that. And aside from that, then they have other Asian markets more or less on their doorstep, their local markets. They've done a lot more business in China last year, basically because after March, the United States was effectively excluded from that market, so they would have picked up the slack there. And they also then, Japan, South Korea are the next big ones. I'm going to talk about the UK later on, but just to flag it there, when I'm mentioning Australia, they would have had a big jump in the exports to the UK in 2025 compared with 2024. Now, we should note that that's coming from a very low base, so we need to keep that in mind. So Brazil beef exports, and this is the one that sort of jumps out at me in terms of spectacular numbers. You know, we start and we go back that and we track this here just for the duration of this century, if you like. And it was 2001 when they would have passed 500,000 tonnes of beef exports for the first time, and at that stage they were sending most of it to the European Union. 2004 they got past 1 million tonnes, and it took them until 2020, and then they passed the 2 million tonnes barrier. And then just last year there, they jumped to 3.5 million tonnes. So you can see it's really been almost a helicopter lift there in terms of the bars on the graph in this slide. And in 2025 alone, they increased by 20% on the year before. I think it was 2.8 million tonnes or something like that they exported in 2024. So that has been a rapid development. Their main markets, just in passing there, has been very much China, and I'll be coming on to China in a minute, and you will see that the two have essentially grown in parallel to each other. The United States is a major export market for Brazil. They had a very sharp trade spat for a few weeks there in the middle of last year, but that has been somewhat resolved, and they sent 272,000 tonnes there, 136,000 tonnes to their neighbours in Chile, and significantly, and in relation to trade deals, 129,000 tonnes to the European Union. Just staying with exports for the moment and looking at the US, third largest, as I said, and the reason for that is, I suppose, why they're a big importer and a big exporter, and those in the process sector will know it's all about getting carcass balance and selling every cut that's in the carcass to the highest value market you can. Well, they would, US imports a lot of, I suppose, what we would loosely describe as manufacturing type beef. They would export a lot of their steak meat and the higher value cuts, mainly to Asian markets. And you can see there, don't need to go through the numbers, Japan, South Korea are huge. China was a huge market for them up until March, but since then they have been essentially excluded from that through a combination of retaliatory tariffs and the fact that China has stopped licensing US factories for export there, part of the, I suppose you might call, the wider diplomatic political spat. I mentioned in the UK and the European Union, they're trivial markets in terms of overall US beef exports, but just to mention them, and I'll be talking about trade deals in a moment, you can see that UK, they sent 2,000 tonnes or thereabouts. This is for the first 10 months of last year, by the way, and the European Union, 9,000 tonnes. Pretty small in the overall context of the volumes that they're producing and exporting. I mentioned when I spoke about Brazil that you can't talk about Brazil's exports without talking about China's imports. And if you go back as recently as 2012, which isn't that terrible long ago, they were importing less than 100,000 tonnes of beef a year. And in the time since then, and particularly in the decade from 2012 to about 2022, their imports absolutely rocketed. And that coincided with the period of rapid expansion as well in Brazil's beef exports. So one basic increase in terms in tandem with the other. They're now sitting at about 2.7, 2.8 million tonnes. The last bar there in the graph shows a sharp fall because that's just the first 10 months of the year to highlight that. But they will come in pretty much similar to what they were in 2024 for 25. And another feature that China has introduced this year that I think will also contribute to that, I suppose, market having reached its peak or reached its potential, and the most we can expect is that it will level off around present levels. They introduced tariffs in the introduced import quota for starting at the beginning of January this year, above which there will be tariffs paid. And just to look at that in a little bit more detail, it's 2.7 million tonnes overall to 2.688 million tonnes for this year. And it's been allocated across all of their major suppliers. And then there's a kind of a general 174,000 tonne quota for other countries that are 172,000 tonnes, sorry, for other countries that, of which Ireland would be one of them, and indeed UK, if we started and got approval to do business there, would participate in. But what's significant about this here is, going back to Brazil's exports for last year, they exported almost 1.7 million tonnes of beef to China, and they've only got a quota this year for 1.1 million tonnes. That means that the balance, over 500,000 tonnes, would be subject, if they were to send that in the same volumes this year as they did last year, that would be subject to a 55% tariff. Now that, even with the relatively cheap price of beef in Brazil, that still will have a serious impact on that business, and it could certainly leave Brazil looking at their other export market opportunities, whether that be in the United States and North America in general, or indeed in Europe. That brings that very much into play. The other country that gets impacted by the Chinese quota is Australia. They supplied 274,000 tonnes of beef in 2025, and again, that's almost 69,000 tonne more than they have quota for this year. So again, if they send the same volume this year as they did last year, then there'll be that amount of a 69,000 tonne paying a 55% tariff. And I think the same rules apply. They'll probably be looking elsewhere if they have the same amount of beef to offer this year rather than paying that tariff in China, because beef in Australia, whilst it's a lot cheaper than it is in Europe, is considerably more expensive at the farm gate than it is in Brazil. So that's something to keep in the back of our minds as a variable that we don't know how it'll pan out yet because it's so new, but it is something certainly that can have an impact at the global level. I have to touch on trade deals, and I'm basically going to mention the Mercosur one. This one doesn't particularly impact on the UK, certainly directly, in that it's with the European Union. And the noise there and the protests there, particularly south of the border, have been very much around the what's considered a generous 99,000 tonne additional beef quota for the Mercosur countries of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay and Uruguay to supply the European market at a favourable 7.5% tariff. That's in addition to a 58,000 tonne Hilton tariff that they have, where the Hilton quota that they have, which will drop from a 20% tariff to a 0% tariff. So that's a potential. And when you think about Brazil and the possibility of facing fairly stiff tariffs in China, then you can see how that Europe would certainly very much come into play as an alternative market for them. In terms of other trade deals the European Union have, they have one with Canada that gives them a 50,000 tonne quota. Again, they've only sent a few thousand tonnes. There's been a lot more beef has gone from Ireland to Canada than has came from Canada to the entire European Union over recent years. And the reason for that it's nothing to do with quota or tariffs. It's the fact that the Canadian industry would much prefer to keep the option of using hormones in their production system than to withdraw hormones to have the European Union as a potential export market. So that one hasn't happened there. There's also European Union made a trade deal with New Zealand that gives them a 10,000 tonne beef quota. That's manageable. And similarly, the one revised with Mexico last year that gives them 5,000 tonnes. So that's essentially the European Union ones. In terms of beef imports then, you can see here that they have been on an upward trend. And looking just at the numbers when I was putting this slide together yesterday, European Union beef imports in 2025 for the first 11 months of the year are at the highest point that they've been at any time since 2010. So that's something to maybe keep in mind, that while there's a sensitivity in terms of European farmers, in terms of in the context of what's coming into the marketplace. Now, one of the things there's the reasons why product gets imported is a lot cheaper, and number two, because there's less domestic production available. And within the European Union, there was a fairly sharp drop in production last year compared to the year before, down to 100,000 tonnes. And the EU medium-term outlook is that over the next decade, that there's going to be a further decline in EU production of up to 600,000 tonnes of what you would call European products. So that creates the pull effect, if you like, in attracting imports. And it's why those that advocate for the Mercosur trade deal will say, well, look, the market can easily absorb that because it's not going to be produced locally anyway. Whether it's, it's also worth noting, actually, and just the finishing point in that slide is there, it's not just an EU issue, this. It's closer to home as well. And if we look at our neighbours across the border, the Republic of Ireland, they were down 200,000 head of cattle last year, which was a very sharp fall, 12% fall. Great Britain, GB, we're down 94,000 head. And in Northern Ireland here, with a 5% drop down to below 500,000, 491,000 last year. So less numbers, fewer cattle about. They're very much an issue for the entire Northern Hemisphere, you might say, between the United States, European Union and UK. So UK trade deals then, and this is in context of the two that stand out, if you like, here in terms of the beef industry are the deals with Australia and New Zealand. They also are equally applicable to the sheep meat industry. But as you can see there, that there's fairly generous quotas given to Australia that's building up to unlimited access over 15 years, and the same in relation to New Zealand. I mentioned earlier there about the US sending just 2,000 tonnes of beef here. There's a 13,200 tonne quota with the US reciprocal. We can export to them to that level. They can export to us. And they're not coming anywhere close to filling it. Again, it's the Canada principle. They don't want to exclude the use of hormones in their production systems. UK also is part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm looking now just at the impact of the Australia-New Zealand trade deal so far, and I'm looking at this very much through Irish eyes, through Republic of Ireland eyes in this context, and I've pulled out 1 month last year here by way of example in September, October 2024, September it is actually. And you can see there that, and if you look at the top half of the slide on the right there, you can see the green that the Irish chunk in 2025 is a lot lower than the non-Irish imports into the UK market in 2025. And that extra non-Irish supplied imports to the UK market were very much coming from Australia and New Zealand there. Don't need to go through the specific numbers on it, but you can see that they stand out very, very clearly in terms of the graph at the bottom. You know, they're coming from an exceptionally low base, of course, but they've grown quite dramatically. Imports from South American countries, then the middle two bars in the bottom graph, have also increased, but not by quite the same level. They don't have the same level. They're paying the full tariff. There's no trade deal between UK and the South American countries. And just bearing in mind Australia, looking at this from the Australian side and their exports, 2025, again, it shot up to 16,000 odd tonnes. In the context of their overall exports, that's tiny. But in terms of the business they're doing in the UK, it has been a growing market. And remember, in this year, 2026, that they have the potential of 69,000, up to 69,000 tonne of their beef that would attract a tariff in China. So they might be looking for more business in the UK than they had been previously too. New Zealand is even more dramatic, the increase in business that they're doing with the UK than Australia. And it's in this month here, it was the last month in the New Zealand export figures, they sent up for the very first time ever over 3,000 tonnes of beef to the UK, 10 times higher than it was in October 2024. And the UK was their third most important beef export market in that month, and that trend I would expect will continue. New Zealand, I suppose, is in pole position in terms of doing business with the UK, and that they've well-established and long-established trade in the lamb, New Zealand lamb, and wider sheep meat. So I think that's one that we can say perhaps in the race between Australia and New Zealand there. New Zealand might have the edge, certainly in the initial phase anyway. So I'm conscious of time and I'm almost there. UK market, we've been round the world, so coming back round close to home, where does it stand? And just looking at the AHDB import data up to the end of November last year, imported almost 220,000 tonnes of beef. Despite the Irish supplies being well down, they're still the biggest supplier by a considerable distance, 148,000 tonnes or thereabouts. Poland is the second most important supplier to the UK for UK imports last year, followed by Australia and New Zealand. Australia slightly actually ahead despite the spectacular numbers that New Zealand exported in October. Of course, if they exported in October, it wouldn't have landed in the UK until December, so the numbers won't synchronise exactly. But the other thing I suppose worth noting in the UK context is that they exported about 100,000 tonnes of beef in the same time, back to the same issue of carcass balance. I was looking just in terms of what I could get in the context of Northern Ireland exports, and thanks to Jacqueline and LMC that I kept her running around the place yesterday searching for data, and it's not easy found, but I just picked up these DERA figures now. They're a few years old at this stage, and I'm not, the numbers don't particularly matter, it's in value, but it is, I think, important to look in the second column there. Beef and sheep meat from Northern Ireland, GB is the main market, full stop, and it's you know, the exports then to across the border, small 157 million or thereabouts. Rest of the European Union even less, whereas you can see GB is the dominant market. And I suppose the benefit from a Northern Ireland point of view, of course, is being part of the UK. It is the domestic market. And it is well known, well recognised, and I think widely understood that the major UK retail outlets and the burger chains would have a very strong commitment to sourcing UK beef, supplemented by Irish beef, which has a kind of associate membership, if you like. And some supermarkets last year would have trialled beef imports from outside of that circuit. Whether that continues or not next year probably will depend on price and supply, as is always the case, but it's not something that we can take for granted, but it's something I think that would have served Northern Ireland farmers very, very well over the years, that commitment in the marketplace. How much under threat is that, given the supply situation and from outside of Europe, Australia and New Zealand in particular? Well, look, the logistics and the distance is always a barrier there, and it's particularly in the fresh meat market. It will have its place in the market outside of the main categories that you like, but it's not maybe the immediate competitor, and it's certainly a much bigger issue, I think, for Irish exports from the Republic of Ireland than it is for UK supplies. Of course, if there is a strong supply situation of UK cattle and there is a strong supply available of imported product from Australia, New Zealand, or anywhere else for that matter, then it can be a drag in the market. So, what's the bottom line? UK is the 5th biggest import market in the world. We've looked across all of the major exporters and the importers, etc. But what really, in terms of the farmers in Northern Ireland, what matters to us the most? So we're part of that. We're the domestic suppliers to that market, and therefore would have a preferred status, if you like. All things being equal, we'll get the nod. And after that, then, it is the European Union that is the main export market. We've seen that in the wider UK context. And trade deals, both at EU level and at UK level, they do mean that it's a less protected market than it would have been up until this point. But we should remember that the non-tariff barriers also make it not that easy to do business here, certainly for all comers, and I'm thinking there in particular hormone policy. And then in terms of, we all hear it's an old saying that the faraway fields always seem the greenest. I would be a big advocate. We need to have access to as many markets as we humanly can around the world to do business in. We have to have that if we can, and it's worth getting that, and it's worth our government officials working hard to secure that access. But the reality is the most valuable markets for us here are the ones that have been beside us. The UK and Europe, Western Europe, have been the highest value beef markets over a prolonged period of time. That's it, folks. Thank you very much for your attention.